So I'm a software engineer. I've been in one for the past 10 years. And the last 7 years, I've been focusing a lot more on front-end development. And now I've joined the web container team at StackBlitz. So I'm still a front-end developer, but it's slightly different. So that's actually a good question. So web container is essentially a Node.js runtime. So if your application has good performance in Node, it should have similar characteristic inside web container, especially on Chrome because the JavaScript engine is identical. It's V8. However, one thing to be mindful of is that spawning processes via Node, the performance of processes is mostly OS dependent, and inside web container it's a bit more expensive, especially memory wise. So that's something to consider, is that you shouldn't spawn a crazy number of processes there. Same with node workers. But other than that, I mean, the best way is always to try it, right? So if you can try inside web container, go on stackblitz.com. It's easy. Yeah. Okay, so actually this question is very dependent on the point of view, I feel like. So if you think about like from a server perspective, like let's say we run things inside a server, well, typically they're using a virtual machine or a Docker container makes more sense because either it's already what you have available, but also more importantly, there's no web browsers there typically. But if we take that from the point of view of an end user that wants to have a development environment, everyone's got a web browser because we spend our time on the web, most of us. And yeah, so there the difference is not identical to the server world. In particular, a VM would be perfect, for instance, for a security researchers that want to study a malware, for instance, because it's a fully sandbox environment that has a very tiny interaction with your host, where you might have like secrets or stuff that you do every day. So for that, a VM would be perfect, but obviously a VM is quite heavy. It needs lots of resources in terms of disk space or even CPU, and the performance characteristic might not be ideal. So that's where, Docker containers typically comes in, because setting up a development environment with containers, it's much more lightweight, it's much faster as well. But still, like, unless you're on Linux, you won't have the best performance. And especially like on macOS, I believe that it's mostly a VM. So you back to square one. And with web container, because everything runs inside the web browser, so first off, you don't need to install anything. You can start it immediately. You get sandboxing capabilities that are not as good as a VM, but are still pretty good, because web browsers need to run the entire internet on your machine. So obviously they really care about security, and we reuse those capabilities as much as we can. So that's where you get a lot of benefit. But at the same time, it's crazy fast. Like, you can boot an environment in seconds. Whereas, for instance, even with Docker, let's say you already have Docker, you might not have the base image, so you might need to pull that in. So it takes some time. Yeah, that's, I think, pretty much it. So it's a good question. So when you use web container inside StackBlitz, you can pretty safely run any untrusted code. But if you use a web container API, with great powers come great responsibilities. So you essentially can run it mostly depends on the interface, like how do you embed and how do you communicate to that web container instance. Um, because you can spawn processes inside web container, you can talk to them and get response from them. And depending on what you do, you might be at risk of XSS attacks, where maybe a user go on your site that uses a web container and craft some data that is going to run inside the container. Then you save that data back on your services, and then when someone else comes, you fetch that data and you load it inside the web container. And actually, the way you have this communication channel, maybe you accidentally provide way too information about that user, and so that could be where you leak some maybe sensitive data about your users, because then I managed to do an XSS attack essentially by doing this. However, again, if you're doing a playground or anything that does not have any sensitive information about your users, well, then there's no issue. You're completely safe, and you shouldn't probably even care about any of what I've just said. This would be really for specific use cases. No, but it's a good question, because in the case of StackBlitz, for instance, a lot of people have been like, oh, it would be nice if we could provide some query parameters inside the URL that would be injected and run as part of the script. But actually, no, because if I get a hold of a project ID I don't have access to, and then I share, to do some phishing attack where I share, and I can actually run code there that then do a post to a server that runs somewhere, because in Node.js you've got access to HTTP requests and stuff. Well, then I can get access to that project essentially, which in that case would be the things that would be leaked. But yeah, hope that made sense. Oh, wow. Yeah, I think I like to learn. Yeah, I like to learn how things works. Actually, I think when I joined StackBlitz, working on web container has been really amazing. Like learning all the problems they had to solve, even the stuff left, because we haven't solved everything yet. It's pretty robust, but there's still a few things to do. And also, like, apart from learning how things work, I think I really also like finding simple solutions for complex problem. And there's a lot of that in web container. Sometimes you're like, oh, let's try to run this crazy library that's going to solve our other issues, but it's bloated, or it has way too many features. So we're going to actually really think more thoroughly about what we are trying to solve, and maybe find a not perfect solution, but good enough, and that is simpler and easier to maintain. I think that's where yeah, that's the type of stuff that I really like too. Also like game dev, but I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm not a game developer. um, so I think there's actually a lot of stuff that's happening today. Like, so one aspect that everyone's, is talking about is AI, obviously, and it's changing how people tend to work. I admit that myself, I haven't really caught on, mostly because when I program, I struggle having additional noise while I'm trying to think. It's too distracting. But I do see the value, and especially I've seen people being extremely productive with it. So definitely web dev is gonna be, maybe it's changed a lot. And we already see lots of example with Figma plugins, or even TL where you draw something and then it you get code at the end. But then on the other hand, if you look really at the technology and what we can do on the web browsers, there are also really interesting things, because we use WebAssembly, and so we follow kind of closely what's happening there. And there's a standard for WebAssembly, which is called WASMGC, which allow you to reuse the garbage collection of the VM inside the browser. And what it means is that you can kind of, if your toolchain reuse it, then you can reduce the size of your WASM that you ship, but also you can probably have a better sharing scenario between JavaScript and the code that run in Wasm. And one thing that's been kind of nice to see is that like the Flutter team, they've been using WasmGC, I believe, for all the application now in Dart, which is kind of nice because when there's people that are going all in on a technology, it means okay, it clearly has potential, and then it's probably going to grow. And once we have that more, maybe web dev is actually going to change a lot because maybe we won't be using JavaScript as much for the front end, although I still think JavaScript will be pretty strong. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And the other thing, I guess, is also I'm pretty curious to see how well, like StackBlitz has this idea of building the web with the web, and how well this is going to be. I think it has a huge potential, and we're already seeing lots of use case inside the design space, and people using it for that. But like doing everything inside web browsers, like release the full vision that StackBlitz originally had, I think that could be pretty cool. It's already there, but there's like almost always a few small missing details. So yeah, I mean, I'm mostly talking about stuff that's probably like a few years away, so that's not the far future, but yeah.